Let's discuss the concept of C as structured language. What do we mean by structured? By structured, we means that we have to write our code. In our case, we have to write in C language. We write the code statement by statement, as we discussed in our pseudocode example, that we consider first activity, then second activity, then third activity. The same way, we write code for the first activity, then for the second activity, then for the third activity. Now, where comes the concept of structured? The structured concept means that we divide or we design our code, that we group our code in functions, or we group our code in code blocks. So this grouping in functions or in code blocks define the concept of structure. If I just give you example of constructing a house, that we have to construct a house, we use bricks in constructing that house, and in that house we construct rooms using that bricks, and when all rooms are constructed, ultimately our house is constructed. So the same concept goes to writing the software or construction of a software, that the basic block in constructing a software is statements. So we using statements we achieve functionality, and for activity, for any functionality, we may group statements in form of functions, or we may group function in form of code blocks. So when we group in form of functions, when we group statements in form of functions or in form of code blocks, then it is called a structured language. That we use the basic building blocks and we structure our code. And here I have mentioned two things, functions and code block. So let me give you the example of functions and code blocks. For example, this example I have taken from our textbook, from the functions chapter. This function swap, the values of x and y. What do we mean by swap? The value of x is assigned to y and the value of y is assigned to x. So this functionality, this swapping functionality, is implemented by these following 4 lines, and these 4 lines are grouped in this function swap. So this swap is acting as a structural component in our code or in our software application, whatever we are developing. So we have gathered statements that are performing some functionality, in our case swapping the values of x and y, and we have grouped these values together. And in programming language, this grouping is done using function. There are many benefits of grouping using functions, that whenever we have to swap two values, then we have only to call this function swap. We have not to write these 4 lines of code. These 4 lines of code that actually do swapping, but we have not to write down these 4 lines. We have to simply write down this swap function. As in the next slide, we see here that this integer main, this is our main function, and we have to swap the values of integer I and j, and we just call this function at this line swap, which is swapping the values of I and j. And if we have to do it any other time, suppose after this printf we may have to swap again, then we have to call this swap function here, and the same functionality is done. So functions are a major block in a structured language, and these are mainly used. So you will see wherever you want to perform a functionality, it is recommended to use functions. You will see in this maybe in chapter 6 or in chapter 7 videos how to write functions, but at this point you can of course understand that functions group statements that are performing some purposeful activity for you. In our case, it is swapping the numbers. So functions are one way of structuring our code. The other way of structuring our code is to use, if I just go back, these code blocks. So we have discussed functions, and now if we go to code blocks, in code blocks we have multiple options. If you refer to chapter 3 of our book, in chapter 3 we have these selection statements and iteration statements. I should write iteration statements. Let's say, so selection statements or iteration, we have these two options there, and what these are doing, that in any statement, in selection statement we have possibilities if or switch. In iterations we have for loop, while loop, do while loop. And if I just show you the example of structuring our block, structuring our code using if statement. So here we see that if statement has grouped these two statements. If this if statement and then these curly braces, these are grouping these two statements, that printf and scanf. Printf is writing the content on screen and scanf is inputting from the keyboard. So this if function has grouped these two things. So this is another example of structuring our content using statements. You can choose any of these statements depending on your requirement. So here my point is that C is a structured language, and C groups the code either using functions or using selection statements or iterations. So you have to decide whatever you have to use, but these are the basic blocks in a structured language. And what is the benefit? If we discuss the benefit of using this structured language concept, the benefit is our code is easier to read. It has improved clarity. It is easier to understand. Once it has clarity, easier to understand, then of course it is easy to debug, and it is easy to enhance the functionality of that code. And definitely you have a less development time. You require less development time if you have your code organized in form of functions and in form of statements, selection statements, or in form of iterations. So it actually reduces your development time. The reason is, whenever you have to use, for example, in our example we discussed to swap the values of two variables. So whenever you require to swap any two values, you call that function. So you have actually developed that function for once, and you can use that function as many times as you require. So here you have to be sure in your mind that C is a structured language, and function is a major block in this structured language concept. There are many other concepts, like object-oriented programming is another concept which you will be studying in your third semester. There are other examples. But at the start point, you must understand that C is a structured language. And of course, you may have question in your mind whether a machine language or a low-level language is a structured language or not a structured language. So I recommend you to Google it and let's see what the result you get.